I was sitting in my living room at 3 in the morning with a baseball bat when I heard someone picking my front door lock. The knob twitched, the deadbolt turned, and the door opened a few inches. Victoria, my former personal trainer, stood there in a black hoodie with pepper spray in one hand and a small leather case in the other. I yelled that I'd already called the police, even though my phone was still on the coffee table. She stared at me with this tight, furious look that made my stomach drop, then spun around and ran down the hallway outside my apartment. I slammed the door, threw every lock, shoved the entry table in front of it, and actually called 911 this time. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the bat while I gave the dispatcher my address and told her a woman I used to train with had just opened my door. While I talked, I stared at the handle, waiting for it to move again, but it didn't. A month earlier, I had no idea this woman would become my nightmare, so let me back up. Back in November 2021, I joined a new fitness club near my office in Phoenix. I'm 24, a graphic designer who'd been working from my one bedroom for over a year, and I'd let myself get soft sitting in front of a screen and living on delivery food. I was out of breath on stairs and sick of telling myself I'd start running next week. The gym was close and had showers, so I finally signed up. That's where I met Victoria, a CrossFit instructor who seemed professional and friendly at first. She looked around 30, fit in that lean trainer way, pacing the floor with a clipboard and yelling encouragement at people. On my first day, she fixed my squat, joked that she couldn't let a new member blow out his knees, and walked me through a quick warm-up. A few days later, she caught me again, offered more tips, then mentioned she had open slots and could give me a discounted personal training package. I took it because I knew I needed someone to keep me from quitting. The first few weeks were solid. She wrote my workouts, pushed me hard, watched my form, and texted reminders not to skip sessions. She asked about my job while we warmed up, remembered I was working on a big logo project, and I figured that was just her building rapport, so I'd keep buying sessions. I even told a coworker he should sign up with her. Then I started noticing she was around more than her schedule said. I'd go at lunch and see her behind the desk on days the whiteboard listed other trainers. And if I switched to mornings, she'd just be getting her own workout in at the exact same time. I'd finish a set, look up, and she'd already be walking toward me like she'd been waiting. I told myself she was just hustling for more clients. Over the next couple weeks, it got more personal. Victoria would step in close to fix my form and leave her hands on my back or shoulders even after I'd adjusted. If I went for water, she'd walk with me, asking about my family, my ex, whether I lived alone, what hours I usually worked. After workouts, she'd hang by the exit and push grabbing protein shakes at the juice bar. And sometimes I went along because saying no every time felt awkward, and I honestly thought maybe she was just lonely. One evening after my shower, I unzipped my gym bag to grab my keys and saw a folded note in the small side pocket I never use, with my name on the front in her rounded handwriting. Inside, she'd written that she felt a strong connection, that the gym was too crowded to really talk, and that she wanted to meet up outside sometime, maybe dinner. Just us. My stomach dropped. I liked her as a trainer, but I wasn't interested in anything romantic, and mixing that with someone spotting me under a barbell sounded like a bad idea. At home, I left the note on my kitchen counter and stared at it for a while. Switching gyms over one weird note felt dramatic, and I didn't want to ghost her and then see her 3 times a week anyway, so I decided I'd be straightforward the next day before our session and keep it calm and professional. When she walked up with her tablet and her usual big smile, I told her I'd gotten the note, that I appreciated all the work she'd done, but I wasn't interested in anything outside a trainer-client relationship and wanted to keep things strictly about workouts. For a second, she didn't move or say anything. Then she smiled and said she understood, that it was totally fine and no big deal. We'd just keep it professional. But her eyes went blank and empty in a way that unsettled me. Over the next week, Victoria started showing up every time I was at the gym, during hours she wasn't scheduled to work. She'd be in the middle of another client's session but staring at me instead of them, asking which days I'd be back until I started going at random times and leaving as soon as I could. Then texts from an unknown number began late at night. First simple hey messages and questions about whether I'd been at the gym that day. When they turned into why are you ignoring me and you act different with me in person, sounding exactly like Victoria, my stomach dropped because I had never given her my number. I checked with the front desk and saw my profile only listed an email, so that weekend I joined a gym across town, canceled my old membership, and hoped it would stop, but the messages kept coming. That Friday, my iPhone started acting wrong while I was working from home, with apps opening and closing on their own, the camera switching on, and random menus popping up. When I opened my photo gallery, there were screenshots of my texts and email inbox from the last few weeks that I knew I hadn't taken. I called Apple support, and the tech had me open my Apple ID devices, where we saw my phone, my laptop, and an iPad I didn't own that had been added about 3 weeks earlier. He explained that whoever had that iPad could see my photos, emails, and real-time location through Find My, which made my hands start shaking. I removed the device, turned off Find My, logged out of everything, and reset every password I used, starting with email and banking. That night, the unknown number sent a new batch of texts saying things like, "You can't hide from me. I know where you live, and you'll regret this," with one message including my street name. I took screenshots, blocked the number, filed a police report with the messages, and an officer called back saying it sounded like stalking, but without a clear suspect or direct threat, they couldn't do much beyond documenting it. Around 3 in the morning, my phone buzzed with an Apple alert that someone was trying to recover my account from an IP address 2 blocks away from my apartment. I knew I wasn't sleeping after that, so I grabbed an aluminum bat from my closet and sat in the living room facing the front door. That's when I heard the lock being picked and the door easing open, and Victoria stood there in a black hoodie with the leather case until I yelled that I'd called the cops, and she bolted down the hallway. After she ran and I actually called 911, officers arrived in about 8 minutes, checked the hallway and parking lot, and pointed out fresh tool marks on my lock and deadbolt. I showed them the texts, the Apple alert, the support email, and told them everything about Victoria, and they took photos before saying a detective would follow up. 2 days later, the detective called to say they'd arrested her after pulling my building's camera footage, matching her car and clothes, and picking her up. When they searched her car, they found my old fitness tracker in the console, printouts of my movement patterns from the tracker app covering weeks, and a knife in that same leather case I'd seen at my door. The detective said she'd installed tracking software on my phone when I left it in the locker room, linked that iPad to my account, and after a psychiatric evaluation showing borderline personality disorder and erotomania, she got 3 years probation, mandatory treatment, and a 500-meter restraining order. It's been almost 4 years now, and I still check my locks 3 times before bed and feel my stomach drop when I see a woman with her build. Because after someone shows up at your door like that, you never feel safe again. Back in the summer of 2019, me and my mate Dylan came to the States for 3 months. He wanted to see national parks. I was planning to hit some design conferences. We flew into Denver, rented a compact, and headed south toward Utah. I did navigation, Dylan handled the budget. We were students, so it was gas, instant noodles, and whatever motels or campsites we could afford. At first, it was easy. Long highways, us arguing over music. On the 4th evening, we were in the middle of nowhere when a warning light came on. A second later, the temperature gauge slammed into the red, and the engine died. Dylan swore and coasted us onto the shoulder. The car was dead. My phone had no reception. Dylan's had 1 bar if he held it against the window. GPS said Moab was about 40 miles away. We let the engine cool, Tried starting it twice. Nothing. Dylan called roadside assistance, gave the rental details, and they said a tow truck would be about 3 hours. Then the guy said a local driver could take us to town now, and the tow would grab the car in the morning. 3 hours on the shoulder versus a ride and a bed. Dylan was already doing budget maths. I didn't like sitting there in the dark, so we agreed. About half an hour later, a pickup's headlights appeared and pulled in front of us. The driver climbed out, maybe 50 in a cowboy hat. "Name's Jim," he said, shaking our hands. He glanced at the engine, said it was cooked, and told us it was fine to leave the car there overnight. We tossed our backpacks in the truck bed and got into the cab. Dylan had been driving all day. Within a few minutes, he was asleep against the window. Jim turned on the radio. It was a religious station, some preacher shouting about punishment and sin. Jim left it on and started talking, telling me about the locals, Mormons, cults, strange people out here, and about a hurricane that washed all the sins off this land. I nodded along, but the way he said it put me on edge. About 10 minutes later, he flicked the indicator on and turned off the highway onto a dirt road. No sign, no lights, just scrub in the high beams. I checked the GPS. The arrow spun, then settled, pointing away from Moab. "Hey, why are we leaving the highway?" I asked. "Shorter route," Jim said. Every part of me hated that answer. I dug my elbow into Dylan's ribs until he woke up. He saw the dirt track, then my face, then the GPS. I watched it click that this was wrong. "Is this definitely the road to Moab?" he asked. Jim didn't answer. He just eased off the accelerator until we rolled to a stop, then clicked the headlights off. The truck went dim. "You boys believe in God?" he asked quietly. Dylan mumbled, Yeah, sure." I swallowed and stayed quiet. Jim turned in his seat to look at us, his eyes empty. "I believe too," he said. "The Lord sends me people to test their faith." Very slowly, he opened the glove box. Inside was a handgun. He didn't pick it up, just rested his hand next to it. "How much money do you have?" he asked. Me and Dylan looked at each other. We had about $300 in cash for the whole trip. Dylan pulled out his wallet, counted quickly, and peeled off $120, then held it out. "That's all," he said. Jim took the notes, looked at them once, and smirked. "That's all?" he said, fingers close to the gun. I forced myself to move slowly, patting my pockets like I was still figuring it out even though I knew how much I had left. Front pockets, jacket, back pocket. I found another 80 folded behind my ID and passed it across. My hand shook. Jim took the notes, counted them, folded the money, slid it into his pocket, closed the glove box with a soft click and said, "You passed the test. The Lord sees honesty." He started the truck without another word, turned us around and headed back toward the highway. Nobody talked. Dylan sat stiff with one hand on the door handle like he might jump if we stopped. I watched the closed glove box and waited for him to reach for it again, but he just steered us off the dirt, checked for traffic and merged like it was a normal late drive. The radio preacher muttered in the background. I stared at the GPS until the line pointed straight at Moab and stayed there. When the town lights finally showed up, I felt my shoulders drop. He took the exit and pulled into a small roadside diner at the edge of town, put the truck in park, looked at us and said, "Go in peace." That was it. I grabbed my backpack and got out. Dylan followed, and we watched his truck roll back onto the road and disappear before we walked inside. The woman behind the counter saw us and froze for a second before asking if we were okay. I told her we'd broken down in the desert, that a local named Jim had picked us up, taken us off the highway, shown us a gun, and made us hand over our cash. Saying it out loud felt unreal, but she didn't doubt it. She poured us water, told us to sit, and told someone in the back to call the police. While we waited, me and Dylan quietly repeated the truck's plate number so we wouldn't forget it. The officer who came in listened, took notes, and asked for our IDs, the rental details, and a description of Jim and his pickup. I gave him the plate. He wrote it down and said there were a few men named Jim around here with similar trucks, and that because we'd accepted the ride and paid it would be hard to prove a crime unless he'd clearly threatened to hurt us. Dylan said he had a gun, and the cop said he believed us. He was just telling us how it would look in court. He still filed a report, told the owner to call if that truck came back, and told us not to take rides from strangers. The owner gave us something cheap to eat, and when it got late, offered the couches in the back room so we didn't have to pay for a motel. We said yes straight away. In the dark, I lay there in my clothes with my backpack under my arm, listening to every car outside. Nothing happened, but I only slept in short bursts. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw Jim's hand resting next to the gun. In the morning, the tow truck brought our rental in from the highway. The mechanic said the engine had overheated and cooked a few parts, then showed us the bill. We had enough, but paying it wiped out most of our cash. After that, there were no bars, no souvenirs, no extra detours. We cut anything that wasn't fuel, food, or a place to sleep, and aimed straight for Denver so we wouldn't risk missing the flight home. The rest of that trip, I couldn't fall asleep in the car. Anytime Dylan left a main road, even just for fuel or a lookout, I'd sit up and check the map and ask how far. At first he snapped that he knew what he was doing. Then he saw I was watching every turn like it might end at another dirt track, and started talking through the route out loud. We still saw the parks and took photos, but it felt different after that night. We never found out what Jim actually wanted. Maybe it was just money. Maybe he liked this test of faith story because it made him feel chosen instead of like a man shaking down tourists. Maybe he had worse ideas and changed his mind when we paid fast and didn't argue. I keep thinking about how calm he was, hand near that glove box but not quite on it, like he knew fear was enough. I still wonder if he's done it to other stranded travelers, and what happened when someone refused, or lied, or simply didn't have anything left. Would he really have used that gun? Or is it just a prop he carries so he can call himself a servant of God instead of a criminal? I'll never know. And that gap bothers me more than losing the money, because it reminds me how close we came to disappearing on some back road in Utah with everyone back in Australia left guessing. Way back in October last year, I was managing a Barnes & Noble on the city outskirts, and helping co-workers was part of my job as supervisor. Our store was medium-sized, not tiny, but nothing special, just one of those places wedged between a pet shop and a gym. Staff changed constantly. Students came in, learned the registers, lasted a couple months, then quit before finals. I tried to treat everyone the same, joked with them, covered shifts when I could, because I figured if the atmosphere was decent, people might actually stay. That month, HR scheduled an interview with a guy named Ryan Dill. He looked older than most of my team, maybe 40. Quiet type, short neat beard, deep eye bags like he'd been tired for years, not just that day. He sat stiff in the chair across from me, hands folded, and answered everything straight. Said he'd moved here from Phoenix a few weeks earlier, used to work warehouse logistics for a company that downsized. He wanted something stable, didn't care if it was glamorous. I'm good with inventory and I don't mind routine, is how he put it. His references were fine, no weird gaps. HR did their checks, gave me the green light, and honestly I was just relieved to have another evening person. Closing shifts are brutal short-handed, so they put Ryan on nights with me, mostly stocking and helping customers if the front got slammed. I went over the basics with him in the back room: returns, where to find the step stools, how we handled damaged books. He nodded a lot, didn't ask many questions, but he paid attention. I remember thinking he seemed a little too serious for a bookstore, but whatever. Not everyone wants to chat about fantasy novels. For the first few weeks, Ryan was what every manager wants. Punctual, never once tried to leave early, took whatever tasks I handed him without complaining. I'd find him refacing shelves without being told, or he'd pull damaged books aside on his own. If I asked him to cover the customer service desk while I dealt with a return, he just said, "Okay," and did it. The only off thing was how he stayed inside his bubble. He barely smiled, never really joined in when the others were joking at the registers. Outside on the smoke breaks, people tried to talk to him. I'd hear later that they'd ask normal stuff, how he liked the town, whether he'd worked retail before. According to them, he'd answer with one word, maybe two, and then stand there staring at the alley or the traffic until his cigarette was gone, then head back in early. I didn't push it. I've worked with enough introverts to know forcing small talk only makes it worse. As long as he was polite to customers and showed up on time, that was what mattered to me. One night near the end of October, we closed at 9 and finished the last of the cleaning a little after. People clocked out and drifted to their cars. I was double-checking that the front doors were locked when I noticed Ryan still in the lot, standing by the far row in this thin jacket, arms folded tight. It was around 40 degrees and a cold drizzle was blowing sideways, the kind that soaks you fast. Everyone else had already driven off. I walked over and asked, "You all right? You waiting on someone?" He glanced at me, then back toward the road. He said his car had died that morning, so he'd taken the bus in and misread the schedule. The last bus back had left 10 minutes earlier. His phone was dead, no charger, and he didn't know any local cab numbers. His apartment was about 4 miles away. He said it like a fact, not fishing for help, just explaining why he was still there. I stood there for a second looking at the rain in his jacket, thinking about that walk along the highway shoulder in the dark. It was on my route home anyway. I told him, "I can give you a ride. I'm going that way." He immediately shook his head and said he didn't want to be a bother. He could walk. That sounded like pride, and maybe embarrassment. I wasn't thrilled about the idea of one of my employees hiking along that road at night, so I pushed a little. "It's really not out of my way. Get in, man. You're going to freeze." After a moment, he exhaled and said, "Okay. Thanks, Ethan." We got into my old Honda Accord, and I pulled out onto the main road. The first few minutes we didn't say anything, just the wipers squeaking and the low hum of the heater finally kicking in. I was running through tomorrow's to-do list in my head when Ryan suddenly asked how long I'd been at the store. I told him about 5 years, that it wasn't exactly a dream career, but it was steady, and I liked the place. He nodded and said he wasn't chasing any kind of career anymore. He just needed rent money and food on the table. It came out very flat, like a line he'd said to himself a lot. The conversation stayed basic after that. Hours, managers, which customers were the worst. Nothing about family or friends. It felt normal enough, though. After we'd driven maybe 2 miles, he pointed at a 24-hour convenience store coming up and asked if I could pull in so he could grab cigarettes. I figured sure, no problem, and turned into the lot, parking close to the doors so he wouldn't get soaked. He got out and headed toward the bright entrance. A minute later, I heard a light knock on the passenger window. Ryan had come back. I unlocked the door and he leaned down, rain speckled across his beard, and said he'd just realized he'd left his wallet back in his locker at work. He asked if I could lend him $20 until our next shift together. It didn't seem like a big deal. I pulled my wallet from the console, peeled off a 20, and handed it over. Ryan took it, said, "I'll pay you back Thursday. Thanks again," and then turned and went into the store. He came back out about 5 minutes later with a small plastic bag and slid into the passenger seat. then put a pack of cigarettes and a bottle of water on his lap. He said, kind of offhand, that he would get gas another day because he was tired and just wanted to be home. I pulled back onto the road and we finished the drive almost in silence again. I remember thinking how normal it felt, like any late ride after closing. Ryan lived in one of those cheap housing complexes on the east side of town, rows of gray buildings with peeling paint and a broken playground in the middle. I had driven past it before but never had a reason to turn in. He pointed toward one of the stairwells and told me to stop there. When I parked, he thanked me again and said he really appreciated the help, that most bosses would not bother. I shrugged and told him it was not a big deal and he should call or text if he ever got stuck again. He nodded, got out, jogged up the stairs, and I saw him unlock a door on the second floor before I pulled away and drove home. The next day at work, he was exactly the same as always. He clocked in on time, grabbed his apron from the hook in the break room, and asked what section I wanted him on. At some point between customers, he walked over to the info desk, pulled a folded 20 from his pocket, and handed it to me without me saying a word. He said, "Here you go, thanks again for last night." No awkwardness, no delay, just matter of fact. I told him it was not a big deal, and joked about charging him interest, and he gave a quick half smile and went back to shelving. I remember feeling pretty good about it, like I had just helped someone out, and that was the end of it. Everything changed a week later. I walked in and saw a group of employees outside the manager office, whispering and staring at the floor. Lisa, our senior cashier, came over and asked if I had heard about Ryan. When I said no, she lowered her voice and said police had come in the night before, talked to the manager, and then walked him out in handcuffs. My stomach pulled tight, and I asked what they had arrested him for, and she said murder. She said detectives from Phoenix had called HR and explained that his wife, Samantha Dill, filed for divorce, and that on the day they were signing he waited in the parking lot, poured gasoline on her car, and set it on fire with her inside. Samantha lived but was badly burned and disabled after months in the hospital. Ryan got 15 years for murder, was released early on the condition he stayed in Arizona, ignored that, moved here under his real name with fake references, and they had been trying to find him ever since. I felt the blood drain from my face and could only picture that rainy night by the pumps. I muttered that I needed the bathroom, splashed water on my face, started shaking, and finally leaned over a toilet and threw up. 4 months later, Ryan was extradited to Arizona and given more time, and I checked news. I stopped giving rides, and whenever a stranger asks for help, I picture him by my car with a can, remember his eyes, and feel cold down spine thinking what could have happened. When I looked at the photo timestamps later, I realized we'd been alone with him on that rooftop for at least 20 minutes. I'm 28 now, but back then I was 19, second-year architecture student, and our urban design professor had given us this big assignment to shoot night photos of urban structures. It sounded pretentious, but it was an easy grade, and I actually liked the idea. My roommate Emily and her boyfriend Ryan agreed to come because going out at 3 a.m. alone just felt stupid. We picked this 7-story parking garage by a closed shopping mall on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just concrete and railings, but it had lines and shadows my professor would love. We took the elevator up, stepped out onto the open roof, and I started setting up my camera while Emily and Ryan sat on the concrete barrier sharing a vape and talking about his job. I got absorbed fast. I kept walking between the pillars, changing angles, adjusting the tripod, timing long exposures. I remember thinking if I did this right, I could coast through the rest of the semester. Every now and then a car passed on the street below, and the sound bounced up, but the rooftop itself was empty. No cars parked on that level, no other people. About half an hour in, I noticed Ryan kept glancing over my shoulder toward the far corner where the stairwell door was. The first couple times I ignored it. Then he did a quick double take and shifted on the barrier like he'd suddenly gotten uncomfortable. I asked what his problem was, half joking, and he said, "I thought someone was standing over there, by the stairs. It's nothing. I think I'm just tired." Emily snorted and told him to stop watching late-night crime documentaries. She said, "If someone wanted to mug us, they'd pick literally any place but a dead mall parking deck." I laughed, but the way Ryan's eyes kept drifting back bothered me more than I wanted to admit. To shut it down, I turned the camera toward that corner and took a couple long exposure shots. In the viewfinder, it was just black around the door, the kind of dark where you can't even see edges. I swung back toward the opposite side of the roof and kept shooting, counting off seconds under my breath, trying to act like nothing was weird. When I finally checked the screen, I scrolled through the last few frames and almost skipped the stairwell ones. Then one image made me stop. In the doorway, there was a solid silhouette of a man. No face, no details, just a human shape cut out of the noise, turned toward us. It didn't look like a smudge or lens flare. He blocked part of the frame too cleanly. My throat went dry. I walked back to them and handed Ryan the camera without saying anything. I watched his expression drain from bored to white in about 2 seconds. He looked up at the actual stairwell. From where we sat, it was empty. Just a dark rectangle at the end of the roof. But all three of us went quiet at the same time. The air felt different, like the assignment part of the night was over. I sat down between them and started flipping backward through earlier photos, more to prove myself wrong than anything. On 3 shots, taken several minutes apart, you could see the same figure. In the first, he was near the far wall by the ramp, just barely inside the light. In the second, he'd shifted closer, partly behind a pillar. In the third, he was near the stairwell door. Always in the shadows, always just outside what we'd noticed in real life. My hands shook a little when I showed Emily. She muttered "nope" under her breath and grabbed her phone. She tried calling the police, but the signal on the roof sucked. The call kept hanging on, connecting, and then dropping. Ryan said we should just take the elevator down fast and get to the car. I said that was a stupid plan, but not to insult him, just because elevators are slow traps. If this guy was using the stairs, he could beat us to a floor and be waiting when the doors opened. The picture of that happening was worse than staying up there another minute. We decided to move quietly instead. Ryan slung my equipment bag over his shoulder so my hands were free. I zipped the camera into my jacket, and we started toward the opposite stairwell, the one farthest from where the figure had been. We tried to hug the pillars and low walls, staying out of the open. Emily went first because she was the fastest. I stayed right behind her, and Ryan kept a few steps back to watch the roof. The walk that had felt casual 10 minutes earlier suddenly felt like crossing a stage. We were maybe 10 feet from the door when we heard fast, heavy footsteps explode from the far side of the roof, hitting the concrete hard. Whoever it was, wasn't hiding anymore. The sound was wrong for someone just coming out to smoke or check a car. It was full sprint straight at us. Ryan didn't hesitate. He yelled, "Run!" And we shoved through the stairwell door and started flying down. We weren't taking steps one by one. We were skipping 2, 3 at a time, hands barely touching the rail. The footsteps followed above us, pounding the stairs, echoing through the concrete. Somewhere around the 5th floor, I heard rough, ragged breathing mixed with the impacts, close enough that I didn't want to know how many flights were between us. On the 4th floor landing, Emily misjudged a step, and her foot slipped. She hit her knee hard and pitched forward. Ryan grabbed the back of her hoodie and yanked her upright without even slowing down, basically hauling her for a few steps until she caught her footing again. None of us said anything. It was just the slap of our shoes, the echo of the heavier steps over us, and the thought that if one of us really fell, the other two were not leaving them. We kept dropping levels like that, hearts going crazy, until the door marked 1 came into view. We smashed into the crash bar and spilled out into the ground floor, then out the exterior door into the night air. We didn't look back up at the building. We just ran, cutting straight across the empty mall lot and then down the street, past dead storefronts and dark windows, until we saw the bright glass of a 24-hour gas station ahead and a bored cashier watching us through the window. Only there, out of breath, we called the police. The cops pulled into the gas station about 15 minutes after we called. 2 cars and way more lights than felt necessary. They talked to the clerk first, then walked over to us and asked who had the car and who had made the call. One officer stayed with us while the others followed Emily's car back to the garage so we didn't have to go alone. Inside, the place looked like it had earlier, just empty concrete and painted numbers. They told us to wait by the ground-level door while they cleared every floor and the roof. The officer with us took our names, student IDs, and my professor's info, kept circling back to whether we were sure someone had actually chased us. My hands were still shaking, and Emily's knee was bleeding through a rip in her jeans, which helped a little with him taking it seriously. After a few minutes, his radio crackled and the officers upstairs said the levels were clear. Roof 2, nobody around, nothing fresh. They sounded annoyed they'd walked 7 flights for us. Right away, the officer relaxed and said it was probably a homeless guy who used the place to sleep or get high, saw our lights, bolted. He said, almost word for word, that this kind of thing happens all the time and we'd scared each other more than anything. I pulled the camera out anyway and asked if he would at least look at the photos. He agreed, kind of distracted, until I slid to the first frame with the figure by the wall. Then he took the camera out of my hands. He called one of the others over, and they stood there scrolling through the 3 shots, watching the silhouette move from the wall to the pillar to the stairwell. Neither of them said anything for a bit, just listened to the radio and kept glancing up toward the ramp above us. Finally, the older one mentioned there had been a couple of assaults on young women around that mall in the last few months, girls cutting through the lots or waiting by their cars late. He told us straight out that whoever was up there with us hadn't just wandered into the wrong place, and that going to isolated structures at 3 in the morning was a bad idea. They followed our car back to campus and waited until we were inside our building before pulling away. The next day, I emailed my professor, told him the location hadn't worked, and he just said to shoot somewhere crowded and turn in whatever I could. I never went back to that garage, and a few weeks later, I sold the camera to another student because I couldn't stand powering it on without seeing that last image in my head. The thing I still circle back to are the timestamps. The first frame where he shows up is marked 3:17 a.m. The clear one in the stairwell doorway is 3:38, 21 minutes of him edging closer while we joked about classes and didn't notice anything. Later, I showed the whole series to a photography professor. He said long exposures in low light can catch movement your eyes miss, and pointed out how the man chose spots where the light hid him from us, but still hit the sensor, meaning he knew exactly how visible he was. I deleted the files, but I see that last frame. His posture tightened and head turned straight at me. Emily won't talk about it, added locks, and I think sometimes ignorance is safer. The old compass in the worn leather case was sitting on my backpack when I woke up that morning, and I knew it hadn't been there the night before. Inside the case was a folded paper with phone numbers and town names I'd never heard of. I was still staring at it when the bartender from the night before knocked on the trailer door and started explaining, like this was already settled. He called it his list of safe stops along my route, pressed the compass into my hand, and said to mail it back once I was safely home. 3 days earlier, I had left Seattle with an empty wallet and a camera full of shots a gallery had just rejected. I'd spent 6 months chasing a project about night workers, the invisible people keeping cities running, and their email said it lacked emotional depth. I read it in a parking lot and realized I had enough money for gas to get halfway back to Boston. So calling my parents for help felt worse than staying broke. I told myself I'd hitchhike the rest, shoot whoever picked me up, and build a new series out of the mess anyway. That first week on the road was rough. I slept sitting up at gas stations when I couldn't afford a room and took rides from whoever stopped, my camera strap wrapped around my wrist and my phone shoved in my front pocket. I shot quick portraits of truckers who looked too tired to refuse, paid for coffee with crumpled bills, and listened to them say I reminded them of their daughter or their ex. Most were harmless, just lonely, but a few asked too many questions, and I forced myself to bail at the next exit long before anything changed. By the time I reached Montana, I was too tired to be picky about rides. A pickup driver dropped me in a small town and pointed to the only bar before he pulled away. It was late afternoon, close enough to dark that I didn't want to be standing on the highway again, so I went inside. The place was quiet, just the bartender behind the counter. He looked about 60, gray beard, heavy hands, the kind of man who seemed used to work. He poured me coffee, eyed my camera, and said hands and eyes tell more than faces. We ended up talking longer than I meant to. Between refills, he told me he and most of the men who drank there had spent their 20s prospecting in the nearby hills, camping by cold streams and chasing rumors of gold. Now, he said, they lived on pensions and tourist season, selling leather belts and little pouches they made by hand. A few regulars drifted in, gave me a quick look, then turned back to their beers. Every time the door opened, we both glanced up, like we were waiting for someone we didn't really want to see walk in. When I finally said I was hitchhiking all the way back to Boston, he went quiet. He set his glass down and told me there were stretches of highway that weren't safe for anyone, especially women alone, and that drivers who stopped weren't always doing it out of kindness. Then he offered me his trailer behind the bar for the night. I said yes because it was dark and the next town was far. Out back, he showed me a bed with a sleeping bag and left a flashlight by the door, telling me to lock it from inside tight. After he left, I sat on the bed with my boots still on and the flashlight in my hand, wondering if I was careful or stupid for trusting a stranger. I watched the door until my eyes wouldn't stay open anymore, and the sound of the wind against the trailer blurred out. When I finally woke up to light through the curtains, my neck ached and my backpack was on the floor by the bed with my jacket on top, and that's when I found the compass on my backpack, sitting right on top where I had left my jacket. The bartender explained over coffee that the note inside held his network, people he trusted along the roads I'd be taking, safe places to stop if things went bad. He told me to call any of those numbers if a driver made me uncomfortable, if I felt watched, if something just felt off. Whoever picked up would tell me where to get off, which diner or gas station I could wait at until I found a better ride. The compass had belonged to his father, heavy metal, a deer scratched into the back. When I tried to hand it back, he shook his head and said I needed it more than he did, that I could mail it home when I made it back to Boston. His address was at the bottom of the note. I kept insisting I'd probably lose it, but he was already walking away, back behind the bar, like the conversation was finished. An hour later, I was back on the highway with the compass in my jacket and the note folded into my camera bag. Every time a car stopped, I'd sneak a look at the list, lining up the town names with the direction I thought I was heading. Over the next 2 weeks, that compass and those numbers saved me more times than I like to think about. Twice I bailed on rides that felt wrong. Both times it started the same way. Driver being nice, chatty, then suddenly wanting to take some quicker way, or pretty detour, down a road I'd never heard of. My stomach would knot up, and I'd quietly dial one of the numbers with my phone on my lap, talking low like I was confirming a hotel booking. The people who answered never sounded surprised. They just asked what mile marker I was near and told me exactly where to ask to be dropped off. Those stops were never dramatic. A diner with a tired waitress who already knew my first name. A gas station where the manager unlocked a side room and said I could stretch out on a folding cot until morning. Sometimes they'd give me a free coffee or a sandwich that accidentally got made wrong. No big speeches, no questions past, "You know him from Montana?" said in this shorthand way, like that was enough. I took some photos, but not a lot. Mostly hands again, people counting bills, filling out logs, adjusting aprons. A few times I didn't even pull the camera out. It felt rude to turn that quiet kindness into content. In South Dakota, an older couple on the list answered on the first ring and told me to come straight to their house. Their place was small, cramped with old furniture and framed school photos. They fed me stew, put fresh sheets on the couch, and argued over who was worse at making up guest beds. The husband kept shaking his head and calling the bartender that stubborn old fool. At one point, the wife said the bartender had once saved their son's life. I asked what happened and she just said, "He picked up the phone when nobody else did," and changed the subject. The next morning, they drove me to the bus station and paid for a ticket to Chicago before I could stop them. I tried to press some cash back into their hands, but the wife closed my fingers around the ticket and told me not to insult them. I slept most of the way with my hand around the compass in my pocket. By the time I got to Pennsylvania, I was only a day or so from Boston. I was tired, but I also felt safer than I had at the start, like I wasn't completely on my own anymore. I still did all the basic safety stuff, texting plate numbers to a friend when I had service, keeping my bag at my feet. But the compass had become this constant weight against my side. Late one afternoon, a middle-aged guy in a clean sedan pulled over. He had a wedding ring, a work badge clipped to his visor, said he was heading toward the city and could take me most of the way. I hesitated for maybe 3 seconds, then got in because I just wanted to be home. It went wrong fast. He rolled through yellow lights, then straight up ran a red. When someone honked, he laughed and said, "Relax, I know these roads." I told him I wasn't in a hurry and asked him to slow down. He brushed it off, kept talking about his job. When I asked him to drop me at the next gas station, he talked over me like he hadn't heard. My chest got tight. I slid my hand into my jacket pocket and felt the compass and the folded note. And for a second, I thought about calling one of the numbers right there. Then he ignored another turnoff I'd pointed at, took a sharp curve onto a side road, and something in me snapped from worry to action. When he finally slowed for another curve, I unbuckled and shoved the door open. The car was still moving, but not fast. I jumped, or fell. Both. I hit the pavement on my shoulder and side and skidded enough to rip my jeans and knock the air out of me. I remember his brakes squealing, then the engine revving like he'd decided I wasn't worth the trouble. A man from a nearby driveway ran over already on the phone with 911. At the hospital, they cleaned the grit out of my skin, stitched my shoulder, did x-rays, asked the same concussion questions on repeat. At some point, I must have blacked out or gone under for scans, because when I really came back around, groggy and upright in a different room, my jacket and backpack were just gone. The driver had taken off with everything the paramedics hadn't grabbed. My camera, my cards, my cash, the compass, the note, every single number. A nurse let me use the desk phone, and friends from Boston drove out to get me and bring me home. In the weeks after, I tried to track the bartender down through directory assistance and late-night searches, but without the bar's name, all I had was some town in Montana off a small highway, and there are a lot of those. Life moved forward whether I was ready or not. I found freelance work, kept shooting, learned to talk about that trip like some wild young story with the dangerous parts sanded down. But 8 years later, I still think about that compass, not because it was some special object, but because a tired old man handed me something from his father, trusted me with his people, and all I can do now is keep that promise in my head instead of in my hands, knowing I never got to walk back into his bar and return what he loaned me. Three years ago, in late August, I was driving back from Boston to Philadelphia after picking up the last of my stuff from the apartment I'd shared with my ex-girlfriend. The breakup had been brutal and drawn out, and I decided to drive overnight to avoid traffic and, honestly, to avoid sitting with my thoughts. I left around 10 p.m., planning to roll into Philly by morning. By about 2:30 in the morning, somewhere in rural Connecticut, I realized I'd barely eaten all day. My stomach burned and my head felt light, so I took an exit for a small town, hoping for a 24-hour diner or at least a gas station vending machine. The exit road was almost completely dead. No cars, no open stores, just one red light cycling for nobody. Street lights showed small houses, shuttered storefronts, a closed bar with its beer signs dark. I kept going because turning around felt like giving up, and after about a mile, I saw bright white lights spilling over the road ahead. It turned out to be a service station and tire shop with a small cafe stuck on the side. Old pole sign, cracked lot, but a row of windows in the cafe and garage were still glowing. Compared to the rest of the town, it looked wide awake, like someone had just forgotten to turn the lights off. The parking lot was empty, but I pulled in and parked by the cafe door anyway. Up close, the cafe was dark. The neon open sign was off, the booths just faint shapes behind the glass. I tried the door out of habit and it was locked. I stood there with my hand on the handle, feeling stupid and hungry, thinking about how many takeout places I'd ordered from in that Boston apartment, and how now I couldn't even find a candy bar. I still needed something in my system if I wanted to stay awake, so I walked around toward the service bays. There were 3 of them. 2 bay doors were rolled up, the third was closed. Inside the middle bay, fluorescent lights were blazing over a blue pickup on the lift, front wheels off, hood open. Toolboxes sat open on the floor, drawers hanging, an air hose coiled across the concrete like someone had dropped it mid-job. It looked like the mechanics had just stepped out for a smoke. I stepped to the edge of the bay and called, "Hey, anyone here?" My voice bounced around the empty shop and died. No answer, no radio, no office noise, just the hum of the lights and distant highway sound. For a second I thought about walking farther in, maybe finding a bell or a vending machine, but common sense finally cut through the hunger. Last thing I needed that night was some small-town cop or owner catching me poking around their shop. I told myself I'd just get back on the interstate, hit the next real rest stop, and live with being hungry for another hour. I walked back toward my car, fishing my keys out of my pocket. The lot felt bigger now that I knew nobody was inside. My little sedan looked tiny sitting alone in the wash of the garage light. I put my hand on the driver's door handle, ready to leave, and that's when I heard engines. At first, it was just a low rumble on the road, like one big truck far away. Then it split into multiple engines, louder and closer, and 4 dark vans turned into the station lot. They were plain commercial vans, no company names or numbers, just dark paint and heavily tinted windows. They didn't pull up to the pumps or the garage doors. They rolled past me and parked nose to tail along the far edge of the lot. All 4 engines shut off almost at the same time, and in the sudden quiet, I realized I was still standing there with my hand frozen on the door handle, just staring. 8 or 9 men in work clothes moved toward a warehouse, one tattooed guy talking while every face turned to me, unsmiling, measuring me quietly. My phone made the low battery warning sound at that exact moment. The little red icon said 4%, and my stomach dropped. I suddenly realized how bad the situation was. Random town, middle of the night, almost dead phone, and a bunch of guys in unmarked vans doing something at a closed station. Whatever they were here for, it wasn't business. I didn't want to be the curious idiot who wandered into someone else's operation. I opened my car door fast, slid into the seat, and hit the lock button with my thumb before I pulled the door shut. I started the engine and made myself move slowly. Headlights on low, no sudden turns, just a normal driver backing out after seeing the place was closed. In the mirror, I saw the men heading toward the warehouse structure attached to the back of the property. One guy was already at the door, doing something at the lock with both hands. The others stood around him in a loose half circle, shoulders angled so their backs were toward the road, like they were trying to block the view from anyone passing by. It looked practiced, like they'd done this before. I turned the wheel and lined up with the exit. As I straightened out, I saw the tattooed guy again in the rear view. He had his head turned just enough that I could tell he was watching me leave. No wave, no nod, just that flat look. It didn't feel like they hadn't noticed me. It felt like they had noticed and decided I wasn't worth dealing with yet. I rolled out onto the empty road at a steady speed, used my turn signal, and made myself stay right at the limit until the station lights disappeared behind the curve. Once the road went dark again, I let the speed creep up. My phone buzzed one more time in the cup holder with another warning and dropped to 3%. I turned it off to save the last bit, because the thought of breaking down out there with a dead phone scared me more than being hungry. For about 20 miles, I just drove and watched my mirrors. Any headlights that stayed behind me for more than a minute made my chest tighten until they finally turned off onto another road. Eventually, the green interstate signs started popping up, and I saw a brighter glow ahead that had to be a major exit. As I got closer, I could make out a chain gas station and a fast food place, pumps full of cars, trucks pulling in and out, people moving around under bright lights. It looked completely normal, and that alone made me feel shaky. I pulled into the gas station lot, parked near the front door, and sat there for a few seconds with my hands locked on the wheel before I shut the engine off and went inside. I grabbed a sandwich and an energy drink, paid, and asked to charge my phone. The cashier pointed to an outlet by the door, and I sat watching the lot while it charged, half expecting those vans. The next day, I told my roommate. He said it was probably some illegal deal. Maybe drugs or stolen parts. Maybe the owner was renting the warehouse or involved himself. I still think about the tattooed guy's cold look, like he was deciding if I was a problem. Since then, I only stop at busy, well-lit places. That night taught me that sometimes an empty parking lot isn't an opportunity, it's a warning. Last February, my husband and I moved into a rental house outside the city. It was an old wooden place with a long driveway and a big yard. We took it because the rent was low and the landlord let us have a dog, and we told ourselves we could live with the drafts and creaks. My husband works night shift at a factory, leaves around 11 at night, and gets back a little after 7 in the morning. I don't love being out there alone, but it seemed quiet, normal. That particular night there was a heavy snowstorm, over 8 inches in a few hours. He left in his truck around 11 and I went to bed around midnight. I woke up at 4 in the morning because the bedroom was freezing. The heat was on. I could hear it through the vents, but the air felt like it had dropped 20 degrees in an hour. Our dog wasn't curled up next to me like usual. She was sitting at the end of the bed, staring toward the doorway, ears up, not making a sound. That bothered me. I checked my phone, saw 4:02, no messages from my husband, and tried to tell myself it was just the storm messing with the temperature. I pulled on a hoodie and socks and went out into the hallway to see if a window had come open or something. I could feel colder air coming from the front of the house. When I stepped into the kitchen, the overhead light was on. I knew I'd turned it off before bed. I always do a last walk around, stove, doors, switches. Seeing that light made my stomach tighten. I walked farther in, telling myself maybe I'd been tired and missed it. Then I saw the front door. It was open, not all the way, maybe 4 inches, but open. Snow had blown in onto the doormat, a thin dusting across the edge of the floor, like it had been that way for a while. I stopped right there. I had locked that door myself before bed, 2 deadbolts and the little chain at the top. I always check them, partly from habit, partly because we used to live in a worse neighborhood and it stuck with me. There was no way I had just forgotten all 3. I went closer and looked at the hardware. Both deadbolts were sitting unlocked. The chain was hanging loose, not broken, just slid off its track. The frame wasn't splintered. Nothing was bent. Nobody had forced their way in. The locks had been opened from inside the house. For a few seconds, I just stood there, trying to find some explanation that didn't involve another person. Maybe the latch hadn't caught. Maybe the wind had done something weird. But you have to physically turn deadbolts. I slammed the door shut and locked both of them again, slid the chain across with shaking hands, and stood with my forehead against the wood, listening. The house sounded normal. That almost made it worse. I started turning on every light I could reach: kitchen, hallway, living room, bathroom, even the little lamp by the entry table. And then I went room to room. I checked the main floor, then the basement, then the attic. The basement was just concrete and our boxes. The attic was mostly empty, insulation and some old junk the landlord had left. I opened closets, looked behind doors, checked under beds, not rushing, actually looking. I kept waiting to catch a shadow moving or hear someone bump into something, but there was nothing. No extra shoes by the doors, no wet coat hanging anywhere. When I looked out the upstairs window at the driveway, there were no strange cars, just my husband's tire tracks already half filled with snow. Back in the hallway, I finally saw what I'd missed before. Wet boot prints bigger than mine, coming in from the front door and looping through the living room. I called my husband, hands shaking, and told him everything. He said he was leaving work and coming home right then, that he'd be there in an hour. After I hung up, I grabbed the biggest knife we owned from the kitchen, went back to the bedroom, and locked the door. The lock was flimsy, but it was something between me and the rest of the house. I sat on the floor with my back against it, knife in both hands. Our dog pressed against my hip and kept staring at the door. I watched the gap under it and tried to breathe quietly. Every little creak from the wood or gust from the storm made me jolt. Twice I picked up my phone to dial 911 and then put it down again, thinking, if they get here and there's nobody, they're going to treat me like I'm crazy. It felt like a long time before I finally saw headlights sweep across the bedroom wall. A minute later, my husband was knocking and saying my name. I made him tell me where we'd gone on our first date before I opened the door. He answered right away and didn't joke about it. When I unlocked it, he looked at the knife, at my face, and didn't say anything. Just took it gently and set it on the dresser. Then he told me to stay right behind him while we went through the house. The lights were still on in every room. At the front door, the boot prints were already drying on the floor, just big, heavy shapes, clearly not mine. He followed them into the living room and back, then checked every room himself, opening closets, looking under the bed, pulling the shower curtain aside. I stayed right behind him. When he was done, he put on his gloves and went outside with a flashlight. I watched from the window while he circled the house. The snow was too deep and had drifted over everything. When he came back in, he said, "I don't see a single footprint except mine from just now." We sat at the kitchen table and he asked if maybe I'd done it myself, brought up sleepwalking, said I could have unlocked everything half asleep. I told him I don't sleepwalk, that I remembered locking the deadbolts and chain, and that the prints weren't mine or his. He dropped it and said we'd stay up till morning. We left the TV on and called the police a little after 8. 2 officers came out, took our statements, checked the door, and looked at the boot marks. One said there were no signs of forced entry. The other asked if anything was missing. We walked through the house and couldn't find anything gone. They said they'd file a report and maybe have patrol cars swing by. But with no forced entry, no theft, and fresh snow over any tracks, there wasn't much they could do. We already had a cheap camera pointed at the front door, but after that morning it didn't feel like enough. So that week we put in an alarm system and added better cameras around the house. It calmed my husband more than it did me. At night I still wake up, lie there listening to every noise, then get up to tug on the front door and feel both deadbolts. Sometimes I sit on the couch and replay the footage from that night. There's a glitch in the recording, and when it comes back the door is already open a few inches. Whoever did it never shows on camera. All I really know is that someone opened that door from the inside, which means they either had a key or they were already in the house when I went to sleep. We never found out who it was. I think about that a lot. About someone walking through our house while I slept 10 feet away, close enough to hear me breathing. I ran barefoot down my street at midnight being chased by 2 guys in ski masks. I remember the slap of the pavement and the way my toes kept catching on rocks. One of them yelled, "Grab him," while the other laughed, and that somehow made it worse. I was 16 and yelling for help like a little kid. Porch lights flicked on, blinds moved, but nobody came out. I kept running toward the main road because that was the only plan my brain had. A police cruiser turned the corner at the same time I did. Its headlights lit all 3 of us up. I tried to stop and almost wiped out. The guys in masks cut away back toward my house like they suddenly wanted nothing to do with the road or the cop. The cruiser braked hard, the door flew open, and the officer yelled for me to get behind the car. I was shaking so bad I could barely get words out, just pointing back toward my yard. Another unit must have been close, because within a minute, there were 2 officers on foot in my driveway. I heard one of them shout, "Got one," and then second one here. When they dragged the 2 figures out from behind the big tree in our front yard and pulled their masks off, my brain just went blank. It was Derek and Ray. We had been in the same group project that week. We ate at the same lunch table. I think I even copied Derek's math homework the day before. They also pulled a duffel bag out from behind that tree. I saw one cop unzip it, stop, and swear under his breath. Later, I found out it was full of duct tape, metal handcuffs, zip ties, and several knives. Not prank stuff. The real thing. Sitting there on the curb wrapped in a borrowed blanket, staring at 2 kids from my English class in handcuffs on my lawn, I kept thinking they know where I live. They were in my yard. But I am getting ahead of myself. This was about 15 years ago, when I was a sophomore in high school. I am 31 now. Back then I was not popular, but I had a solid little group. My buddy Grant, a few kids from cross country, a couple of nerdy gamer friends. Derek and Ray were school friends only. We joked around at lunch and got paired up in labs sometimes. I never invited them over and never talked to them outside school. They always felt off. Not the kind of off where a kid just listens to weird music, more the kind where you feel watched. They would ask things like, "So your parents both work late, or you ever have the house to yourself?" and then shrug and switch topics before I could answer properly. One time, Ray saw a photo of my backyard on my phone and said it looked perfectly private, then grinned at Derek. I laughed it off because I did not know what else to do. At 16, you assume people are awkward, not dangerous. That May weekend, my parents went down south to hit the beaches for a long weekend. We lived in a quiet suburb. I had never been in trouble, and they trusted me. My mom taped a list of emergency numbers to the fridge. My dad did the usual no-party speech, and they drove off Friday after work. Being an only child, having the whole house to myself, felt like the best thing that had ever happened to me. I had a short stack of movies I wanted to watch, and Grant said he would swing by to hang out. By about 11, I was alone in the living room with a second movie playing. Friends had been over earlier, but all of them were gone. In a quiet part, I heard steps on the deck outside. I paused the movie, listened, then grabbed a flashlight and stepped into our big yard with the pool and my mom's garden, walked the shed and fence trees, found nothing. Feeling foolish, I headed back inside. I opened the door and went back to the living room where my movie was still paused. I felt dumb about walking the yard with a flashlight, like I had scared myself for nothing. I dropped the flashlight on the coffee table, grabbed the remote, and hit play. Maybe a second passed before I saw movement in the doorway between the living room and kitchen. A dark figure was just there. He wore a black ski mask, hoodie, dark pants. No face, just a shape staring at me. For a split second I thought it was a joke, that it was Grant or one of my friends. But the guy was taller than any of them, and he did not say a word. Before I could stand up, he lunged at me. I shoved backward off the couch, more falling than dodging, and felt his hand skim across my shoulder and miss. I did not look back or try to see what he had. I just ran for the front hall as hard as my legs would go. The front door was locked because my parents always drilled that into me, but my hands still did what they were supposed to do, even though they were shaking. I yanked the chain off, turned the deadbolt, and pulled. Behind me, I heard his shoes on the hardwood getting closer. I almost slipped on the entry rug but stayed on my feet and forced the door open enough to squeeze through. I did not bother closing it. I hit the front steps at a run, and then I was in the street barefoot, feeling rocks under my feet but not slowing down. I could hear him behind me for a few seconds. Heavier footsteps, then nothing. I did not look back. I went straight for the house 2 doors down where the older couple lived because I knew they would answer. I pounded on their door and rang the bell until Mr. Hansen opened it. I blurted that someone was in my house wearing a mask and I thought he had a knife. He pulled me inside, locked the door, and told his wife to call the police. Within maybe 10 or 15 minutes, there were flashing lights all over my street. An officer came to the Hansens, asked me a few quick questions, then told me to stay inside while they checked my house. Through the window, I saw 2 of them go in my front door, while another walked along the side of the house with a flashlight. A few minutes later, his voice came over the radio on the cop in the living room, saying he had a suspect hiding by a tree in the side yard. Another voice cut in and said, "Make that 2 suspects, both dressed in black." They walked them out to the front where I could see between the curtains, both in ski masks with their hands cuffed behind their backs, one of them carrying a dark duffel bag like he had just come back from the gym. When they finally pulled the masks off, I recognized them immediately. It was Ray and Derek from school. A cop unzipped the duffel and spread the contents on a hood so I saw what they brought. There were spare clothes, a roll of duct tape, metal handcuffs, and several knives. Later, I found out Derek did time for it, and Ray got probation while his family moved away. I wonder if they meant to kill me. The bag says yes, but I keep telling myself no. My old roommate Marcy remembered a person I had completely erased from memory, and the way she brought him up made something deep in my gut twist, even before I could figure out why exactly. Last month we ran into each other at a coffee shop in Tempe, did the usual small talk about work and rent, and I mentioned nightmares I keep having about being stuck in a warehouse. As soon as I said warehouse, she stopped smiling and asked if I meant the one from when I was working nights, and I told her I had never worked nights in any warehouse ever. She went a kind of flat, pale, not dramatic movie, fainting pale, and said she remembered a middle-aged guy in a gray van dropping me at the dorm early a couple mornings a week. She said every time I came in from that van, I looked shaky and kind of sick, like hungover without drinking, and I laughed it off while my stomach twisted at the words, gray van. She kept asking if that job had been sketchy, if I ever reported him. Then she described my black hoodie and ripped backpack from freshman year, and it felt like pressure building behind my eyes. I changed the subject to her job and boyfriend, pretended everything was normal until it was polite to leave, then dropped my keys twice in the parking lot because my hands would not stop shaking. After that coffee shop thing, I started thinking about those months after I left home at 19, when I moved from Oregon to Phoenix and tried to pay for school completely on my own back. I was renting a room in a student neighborhood, broke and stubborn. So when I saw a flyer that said, night work, cash paid easy at a bus stop, I called the number away immediately. A guy with a voice picked up, said it was an electronics warehouse needing someone to sort returns from midnight to 8, asked if I was 18 and had a car, and I said yes. The warehouse was out in some dead industrial strip, just tall shelves and fluorescent lights, and on my first night the supervisor walked me around and said I would be working alone the whole time. He pointed at a clipboard by the door where I was supposed to write my hours, promised cash in an envelope every Friday, and I tried not to think about how there were no workers. For the last 6 months, I have been having the same nightmare about that warehouse, long before the coffee shop, and in it I am trying to reach the exit, but the aisles keep stretching. In the dream, I walk down the middle aisle with tall shelves on both sides and hear footsteps behind me that speed up and slow down, but never get close enough to turn around either. When I try to cut across a row to look, there is always a stack of boxes blocking the way, and my chest starts to feel tight like I have been running for hours already. The dream always ends with me spotting the loading dock door at the back, sprinting toward it while those footsteps pound behind me, yanking the handle, finding it locked, and waking up soaked in sweat. After I calm down, I get this foggy memory of someone who used to appear there, a thin, middle-aged man whose outline I recall but never his face, always in my peripheral vision only. In those bits, I remember him standing near the loading dock or halfway down an aisle, not talking, watching, and it feels like some part of me decided then not to look straight at him. The weirdest part is what my mom told me when I asked about it. She said I did work nights at a warehouse, called her Crying Friday, said I quit, and refused to explain why. She says I only worked there 6 weeks before I suddenly stopped going, but when I reach back it feels like I stayed in that warehouse for months instead, and those nights still feel unfinished. There are 2 specific incidents I remember that make me feel physically sick when I try to think about them clearly, like my body knows more than my head will admit. The first one is the refrigerated storage unit, a walk-in room they used for certain electronics that could not get too warm. In the memory, he is standing in the doorway with his clipboard, saying I messed up item numbers and that mistakes cost money. I keep apologizing and offering to stay late to fix it, but he just tells me to step inside for a reminder. He says I have to stay there until he comes back. At first, I kept telling myself it was fine, that he was just being strict, and this was better than getting fired. So I stood by the metal shelves and tried to recite formulas from my math class. After a while, my teeth started banging together so hard my jaw hurt, and I stared at the little red temperature display, watching it blink the same number again and again. I did not yell or pound on the door because I did not want him to think I could not handle it, or did not deserve that job back then anyway. I do not know how long he actually left me inside that room, but in my head it stretches like an hour or more of just shivering and shifting my weight from foot to keep feeling in my toes. When he finally opened the door, the warmer air almost burned. He looked me up and down like I was a product, nodded once, said something like, "See, you will remember now," and sent me straight back to lifting boxes. My hands would not stop shaking, and that was before he started the other thing, the dark game later. On certain nights, sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning after I'd been working alone for hours, every light in the warehouse would shut off at once with this loud click, and I would be standing in sudden dark with only the exit signs glowing far away. At first, I thought it was a power problem, but then his voice would float out from somewhere between the shelves, saying I could not take my lunch break until I found him and asked for permission. He said it was training. To me, it felt like being hunted every time. There was a small flashlight taped under the main workstation, and he acted like that made everything reasonable. I would take it and start walking the aisles, the beam shaking over pallets and boxes while my stomach cramped from hunger and my head pounded. I called his name, tried to sound respectful, sometimes heard a laugh or a shoe scrape just out of sight. It never ended quickly. I circled that place for what felt like hours. I should have left or called someone, but I was 19, broke, scared, and so sure there was no other option back then. One night is clearer than the rest. I had worked 6 hours with no break, walking down aisle when the flashlight beam caught a figure crouched on the top shelf, high above me. We both froze. I could not see his face, but I knew he was smiling before he climbed down, practiced and quick, metal shaking under him. I turned and ran, and everything in my head stops there. Mom remembers me saying the job was strange. Marcy remembers the van. I tried to contact the warehouse, but it closed in 2019. I want to know who he was. So, when I was 21, I started at the Chicago Institute of Art and Design, majoring in graphic design with a minor in digital illustration. The institute was small, maybe 500 students total, in this converted warehouse in the West Loop. Everything was open floor plan, big studio spaces instead of normal classrooms, so people from different departments were always drifting through your area. It was great for collaboration, but terrible for personal boundaries. Still, I was just excited to finally be around other art kids, build a real portfolio, maybe land an internship, and prove to my parents that moving to the city hadn't been a huge mistake. The first few weeks were honestly great. I fell into a little group pretty fast, mostly other first years and one photography major who knew all the gossip. We stayed in the studios late, shared snacks, complained about broken printers, and swapped brushes and tablet pens like trading cards. The professors were intense but actually helpful, not like high school teachers who barely knew Photoshop. I loved the assignments, even the tedious ones, and I liked the feeling of walking into that big, echoey building knowing I was supposed to be there. I'd go home exhausted, fingers stained with ink, and go to bed already thinking about what I'd work on the next day. Then I met Kyle. Kyle was a 25-year-old grad student in the computer graphics department, working on some 3D modeling software project people kept saying was super advanced. We first crossed paths in the shared computer lab one night when I was rendering a project. It was late, most of the lights were off, just a few computers humming. I had my headphones in, half asleep, when he sat down right next to me even though there were plenty of open stations. He didn't ask, just rolled his chair over and logged in. A minute later, he was leaning toward my monitor, close enough that I could feel his breath on my cheek, and started offering unsolicited advice about my layers, my file names, my color choices. I pulled off one earbud and tried to keep my voice neutral. I told him I'd already cleared the layout with my professor, and I just needed the machine to finish rendering. Instead of taking the hint, he doubled down, talking about how first years always underestimate render times and how he could totally help optimize my workflow. Every time I shifted away, he'd lean in more, one hand on the back of my chair like a fence. Then the questions started slipping in between the tech talk. Where did I live? Did I commute or walk? Was I close enough to cut through the alleys? Did I live alone? Did I have a boyfriend? What did I usually do on weekends when I wasn't chained to the lab? I answered in the vaguest way possible. West Side, roommates, busy, and pretended to really focus on my screen. His pushiness made me uncomfortable, but I told myself he was probably just socially awkward. Grad students were older, more intense. Maybe this was normal. When my file finally finished, I saved everything, yanked out my flash drive and told him I had to go because the train ran less often late at night. I shoved my stuff into my bag while he kept talking like we'd see each other again for sure. When I was halfway to the door, he called after me, voice weirdly cheerful in the empty lab. "See you tomorrow, Maria." I froze for half a second. I was almost sure I hadn't told him my name. Over the next several days, Kyle started showing up everywhere I was. If I worked in the main studio during the day, he'd wander in, by accident, do this fake surprised face, then sit across from me and pretend to work while glancing over his monitor every few minutes. If I was in the cafeteria, he'd appear with a tray and ask if he could sit, already halfway into the chair before I could answer. I stayed polite but distant, kept my replies short, eyes on my sketchbook or phone, hoping he'd get bored and find someone else to hover around. Instead, he moved online. Somehow he found my Instagram and started sending long messages, commenting on old posts, talking like we had inside jokes already. I answered once out of politeness, then stopped opening them. The unread count climbed. Then came friend requests on Facebook, Twitter, even LinkedIn. I ignored all of them and locked everything down, switched some usernames, tightened my privacy settings. That seemed to just push him back into real life. One morning I went into the studio early to get a jump on a project and found a coffee and a croissant sitting on my usual desk, still warm, with a folded note under the lid. It said, in neat handwriting, "Thought you'd like this. K." No one else was in the room. I hadn't told anyone what time I usually came in, or even that I preferred that corner desk. My first reaction was stupid guilt, like it would be rude not to drink it, like I was overreacting. Then I thought about him knowing which desk was mine and what time I showed up, and the guilt turned into anger. I picked up the coffee and the croissant, walked straight to the trash can, and dumped both in without tasting either. I crumpled the note into a tight little ball and shoved it into my pocket. Then I went looking for my friend Jess in the print lab and told her everything, from the computer lab night to the constant coincidences to the messages and the food left on my desk. As I talked, her face went from amused to tight and serious. She lowered her voice and said Kyle had a reputation in the grad program for not understanding rejection. Things escalated when he started physically following me, at first as quick glimpses across the street on my walk home, far enough away to deny it. After a few days, it was constant, always the same distance behind, always choosing my route, crossing when I crossed, never getting close enough to speak. One evening I turned the corner to my dorm and saw him leaning against the gate, hands in his pockets, looking straight at the entrance buzzer. I asked the girl behind me to wait, walked over, and said, "Kyle, what are you doing here? You do not live in this building." He gave this fake confused smile and said he was just walking around the neighborhood, checking out buildings, that he thought some friends lived nearby. I told him clearly not to wait outside my dorm again, that it made me uncomfortable and crossed a line, and then I went inside shaking. The next week I was working late in a small studio, locked the door from inside around 9 at night, and tried to focus on my project. When the handle started rattling hard, over and over, I froze, then stood up slowly and saw Kyle through the glass panel yanking on the door. He was knocking with the side of his fist and shouting, "Maria, open up! I know you are in there! Open the door! Stop ignoring me!" Instead of security, I called my classmate Lena, told her very quietly what was happening, and asked her to stay on the line until he left. He kept rattling the handle and knocking for what Lena timed as almost 20 minutes. Then the noise stopped, and when I looked again, the hallway was empty. When Lena told me to call campus security, I realized my hands were shaking so badly I could not hit the numbers, so she emailed our professor instead. The next day, I went straight to the Dean of Student Affairs with Jess, told her everything from the first lab encounter to the studio door, and showed Lena's text. She listened without interrupting, took notes, and said she would have a talk with Kyle, but warned that without direct threats or violence, the Institute's options were limited. 2 days later, he sent a long email to my school account, accusing me of being arrogant, dramatic, and ruining his reputation with what he called false accusations. Buried near the end was the line, "You will regret rejecting me," and seeing that in writing made my stomach twist more than the yelling at the door. I printed the email, highlighted that sentence, and took it straight back to the dean, who frowned and said this changed things because it counted as a threat. That same evening, walking back to my dorm just before dark, I noticed footsteps behind me, turned slightly, and saw Kyle following about 10 meters back, not hiding. I ducked into a convenience store on the corner, pretended to browse snacks, and called my dorm neighbor Alex, who studied architecture and usually kept his cool. Alex showed up about 5 minutes later, walked straight to the front of the store, looked out, and said calmly that Kyle was still waiting on the sidewalk. We walked out together, and Alex went right up to him and said, "You need to leave her alone and stop following her, right now." Kyle puffed up like he wanted to fight, stepping closer into Alex's space, but Alex just stared him down, taller and steady, until Kyle finally swore, turned, and walked away. That was just the beginning. I've been driving trucks for 15 years now, and you learn to spot trouble before it finds you. But that November night, I made a bad call taking the shortcut through the old industrial park outside Portland. It was 2 in the morning. I was hauling furniture from Seattle and running behind schedule because of traffic. The highway would add 40 minutes, so I turned onto the access road that cuts through the abandoned factory district. Most of those buildings shut down years ago, and now it's just empty warehouses and cracked parking lots. The road there is narrow, barely 2 lanes, with chain-link fences on both sides, and no shoulder worth mentioning. Rain was coming down hard, and my wipers were on full speed, still barely keeping up. I'd used this route plenty of times, and never seen another soul out there. About halfway through, between 2 massive storage hangars, I saw something in the road ahead. At first it was just a dark lump in the glare of the headlights, low and uneven, like maybe a car half in the lane with no lights on. I eased off the accelerator and checked my mirrors, making sure nobody was behind me. Dispatch hates when we use that road. They always say if anything happens out there, you're on your own until county shows up. I knew that, but I was late, tired, and just wanted the load dropped so I could get a couple hours in a cheap motel before running back north. I told myself it was probably some guy with a dead battery, maybe spun out in the rain and standing by his car. As I rolled closer, the shape straightened and my stomach dropped. It wasn't a car. It was a man standing dead center in the road, arms spread out wide like he was blocking the way on purpose. I was already riding the brake, but I hit it harder and felt the weight of the trailer push forward behind me. He was tall, maybe 6'2", wearing dark coveralls that were soaked and hanging off him. For half a second, I thought he might be some kind of night maintenance guy I hadn't heard about. Then my headlights climbed up his chest and hit his face, and everything in me went tight. His face was covered in white stuff, thick and uneven, smeared into his hairline and down his neck. Not neat makeup, not anything that looked like a costume. Just caked on like he'd shoved his head into a bag of powder. His eyes were just black pits in all that white. No shine, no expression. He didn't squint at the lights or move his arms. He just stared at my truck with his arms stretched out. I blew the horn, 2 short blasts, the usual "move it" warning. Nothing. He didn't move, didn't even twitch. The wipers thumped back and forth, and he just stood there in the rain like he could have stood there all night. I glanced at the dash cam to make sure the little red light was on. Old habit from when I did a short stint as a reserve deputy. Weird situations mean you want video. I rolled the window down a couple inches and yelled, "Hey, get off the road!" My voice bounced off the metal walls of the hangars and came right back at me. He didn't answer. The only sound was the engine idling and the rain on the hood. That's when he started walking toward my cab, slow shuffling steps with his arms still spread. I hit the horn again, longer this time, really leaning on it. He kept coming like he couldn't hear a thing. When he got maybe 10 feet from the bumper, I could see his face clearly. It wasn't paint. It was flour or some kind of white powder packed on thick, with little streaks where the rain had cut paths through it. His eyes had this strange shine to them, wide open, like he hadn't blinked in a long time. He stepped right up to the front of the truck and set both palms flat on the hood, fingers spread, like he was feeling the vibration. I watched his hands, waiting for him to pull something from a sleeve, a knife, anything. But he just stood there staring up at me. My right foot hovered between brake and throttle, fighting the instinct to jerk forward. If I hit him, even by accident, I'd be dealing with that for the rest of my life. After a few seconds, he started moving again, sliding his hands along the metal as he walked around to the driver's side. I kept him in sight as long as I could, then lost him in the corner of the windshield and picked him up in the side mirror. For a second, our eyes met through the glass. There was nothing there I recognized. I reached for my phone on the dash, thumb already moving to hit 911. No signal, just empty bars. I swore under my breath. That whole industrial park is a dead zone. The truck radio would only reach dispatch once I got back near the highway. Out here, I was on my own. He reached my door and tried the handle like he expected it to open. When it didn't, he paused, then started hitting the window with his open palm. Not punching, not trying to break it. Just methodical slapping, over and over, same rhythm. Each smack made the glass jump, but not crack. He kept his face close, watching me while he did it. I revved the engine hard, a quick stomp, trying to scare him off with the noise and shake. He didn't react at all. No flinch, no step back. Just kept slapping the glass in that steady beat. My brain ran through options. Sit there and hope he got bored. Try backing the whole stretch between the hangars in pouring rain and risk jackknifing the trailer. Or pull forward and go around him, praying he didn't grab onto anything and get himself killed. None of those sounded good, but sitting still with him at my door sounded worse. I dropped the truck into gear, foot still on the brake, and started to turn the wheel, planning to edge past and give him as much room as I could. The moment the cab shifted, he stopped slapping. His eyes flicked down, then back up at me. Before I could move an inch, he suddenly threw himself in front of the wheels, lying flat on the wet asphalt with his arms still spread out. I couldn't run over a person, not even this lunatic, so I sat there with the engine idling while he lay in front of my truck in the rain. My foot hovered on the pedal, but I could not push it down. I flipped the hazards on and watched the clock on the dash. After maybe 2 minutes, he rolled to his side, got up slow, and shuffled toward the passenger side of the cab. I watched him in the mirror, my hand resting near the air horn even though it had not done a thing before. He grabbed the passenger handle, gave it a couple of hard pulls, then let go when it stayed locked. I still hit the lock switch again like an idiot. He walked back in front of the truck, lowered himself onto the wet pavement, and stretched his arms out under the bumper again there. That became the pattern for a while. He would lie there without moving, then stand up, shuffle around the truck, test both doors, slap my window 3 or 4 times in that same dead rhythm, then go back to lying in front of the wheels. I lost track of how many times he did it. Every pass made me jump before his hand hit the glass, and my hands were locked around the steering wheel. The road is too narrow to go around anyone, and backing up would have meant almost a mile in reverse on wet pavement with a loaded trailer and no shoulder. If I messed that up and jackknifed, I would be stuck there with him and a useless rig. Getting out to talk was not an option either. So I sat there while he kept running that loop until, after about 10 minutes, he finally changed. Instead of lying down again, he pushed himself up, turned his back on the truck, and started shuffling toward the warehouses like nothing had happened. He did not look at me once. He slipped through a gap in the fence and vanished between 2 loading bays. I stared at the empty road for a couple of seconds, then dropped the truck into gear, stomped the accelerator, and headed for the exit of that industrial park. The rig lurched forward harder than I meant, but I kept my foot on it and watched the center line instead of the mirrors. I took the first intersection without really stopping, just checked once for headlights and rolled the red. I did the same at the next light. When I finally hit the highway and saw other cars, I kept going until a big gas station 20 miles down came into view for me. I pulled off, parked along the far edge of the lot, set the brake, and sat there while the engine ticked. My hands were still shaking on the wheel. After a minute, I climbed down, went inside, and bought a cheap coffee from the counter. I sat in the corner near the window and sipped it until the cup was almost empty, and my hands felt steady enough to get back on the road again. By the time I got home, the sky was getting light and my wife was asleep on the couch. She asked why I was late and I told her traffic and rain, which was not a lie. I never told her about the man. I stay on the highway, tell new drivers shortcut is useless, and I am sure he was not random drunk, but someone who planned it and might do it again someday. I realized I was in a trap only when I heard the second voice. The same one, but now coming from the phone speaker and simultaneously from somewhere above me in the house. But before I get into that, let me back up a bit. This happened about 2 years ago when I was 22 and working as a field technician for an internet provider that handled the suburban areas around our city. The job was simple enough. Drive out, install or replace routers, check signal levels, crawl into awkward spaces, try not to piss off customers who'd been without internet for a few hours. Some days were slammed, some were dead. It all blurred together. That day was one of the regular ones. Around 2 p.m., I got a ticket on my work phone. Signal issues at a new cottage development on the west side of town. Those places popped up constantly back then. Fresh builds, barely finished landscaping, half the houses still wrapped in plastic. Dispatch loved them because new houses usually meant easy installs and clean wiring. The ticket had a full address, clear description, and a contact number. Nothing special. I called the customer while I was still sitting in my van. He picked up right away. Male voice, calm, kind of neutral, maybe late 30s from the sound of it. He said his internet kept dropping, that he worked from home and needed it stable. I checked the GPS and told him I'd be there in about 25 minutes. He just said, "Perfect, I'll stay around," and hung up. No weird vibe, no attitude, nothing that stuck out in my head. The drive there was uneventful, a bit of traffic leaving downtown, then empty roads. When I pulled into the development, it looked like every other new build zone. A few finished houses, a lot of half-built ones, dirt everywhere, construction vans scattered around. The address led me to a 2-story house with beige siding, dark framed windows, and a bare front yard. No car in the driveway, no curtains, no welcome mat, no sign that anyone actually lived there yet. That's pretty normal for early installs, so I didn't question it. I parked at the curb, logged my arrival in the app, and called the number again. He answered on the first ring. Same tone, maybe a little hurried now. He told me the router was down in the utility room on the basement level and asked me to come in through the side door, said it was open. That isn't unheard of. Some people don't want to deal with shoes or tracking dust through the main entrance. I grabbed my tool bag from the passenger seat and walked along the side of the house. The yard was just packed dirt and scattered gravel. No fence, no plants, just raw lot. The side door was there like he said, slightly open, not latched all the way. That actually made sense if he was expecting me. I nudged it with my foot and called out, "Hello, internet tech." The way I always do so nobody thinks a random guy is sneaking into their place. No answer. I stepped into a short hallway with stairs leading down to the basement. Inside, it was quiet. No TV, no voices, no footsteps. Just that empty new house silence. Through the phone, he said, "Go downstairs. You'll see a gray door on the right. Go in. The router is on the far wall. I need about 5 minutes. I'm finishing something upstairs." His voice sounded the same as before. Steady, clear, with that faint phone line hiss behind it. I said, "Okay, I'll take a look," and started down. The basement hallway was plain drywall, unmarked, smelled faintly like fresh paint. I saw the gray door on the right, just where he'd said. I turned the handle, went inside, and hit the light switch. One bare bulb came on overhead, lighting up a utility room. Concrete walls, exposed pipes, nothing else. On the far wall, a white router was mounted at about chest height. I remember thinking, good, at least they put it at a normal height this time. I walked closer and stopped. No cables, no power cord, no Ethernet, no coax. The router wasn't even plugged into anything. No lights, nothing. It looked like someone had taken a brand new router, screwed it to the wall, and then just walked away. The room was completely empty otherwise. No shelves, no boxes, no cleaning supplies, no water heater, nothing. Just concrete, the smell of paint, and that useless plastic box. For a signal issues call, it didn't add up. Usually I'd see at least an entry point for the line. A fiber ONT, a coke splitter, something. I walked the wall with my eyes, then with my hand, looking for any drilled hole, any junction box. There was nothing. It felt less like a utility room and more like a set someone had built who didn't actually know how internet installs work. That was the first moment I felt something was off in a way that had nothing to do with networking. I called the number again, standing right under the bulb. He picked up just as fast. "Hey," I said. "I'm in the utility room, but the router isn't connected to anything. There's no line here at all." There was a short pause on his end, like half a second. Then he said, "Yeah, that's the issue. We need to run a cable from the adjacent room. There's a door to your left." I turned automatically, and sure enough there was another gray door on the left wall that I hadn't really registered when I came in. "Go in there. You'll see the distribution box," the voice in my ear continued. I adjusted the strap of my bag and reached for the handle. And right then, I heard the exact same words, same phrasing, same rhythm, even the same little breath between "there" and "you'll," coming from somewhere above me in the house, muffled through the ceiling, maybe a second behind what I was hearing in the phone. My hand stopped on the handle. For a couple of seconds, my brain tried to explain it away. Echo, bad reception, something with the line. But it didn't fit. A guy can't be on the phone with me in real time and also be upstairs saying the same sentence with a delay. Not like that. That's when I started really looking around the room, not as a tech, but as someone who suddenly realized this wasn't a normal job. In the far corner up near the ceiling, sitting on a narrow ledge I hadn't noticed, was a small Bluetooth speaker, one of those cheap portable ones, with a cable hanging down that wasn't plugged into anything. On the floor by the opposite wall, face down, was a smartphone in a black case, screen dark. The voice in my ear said, "You there? Go into the next room. I'll come down to help in a second." But I wasn't focused on the phone anymore, because above me, from somewhere in the house, I could already hear his footsteps, slow, heading toward the staircase. I didn't wait for explanations. In my job, you get used to weird customers and messy houses, but there was nothing normal about realizing someone had basically rehearsed what they were saying to get me downstairs alone. Shoving my phone in my pocket and grabbing my bag, I rushed out of the utility room back into the hallway. Upstairs, a door creaked. Someone was starting to come down the stairs. The way the sound echoed through that empty place hit me harder than anything he'd actually said, because it meant he wasn't just a voice anymore. He was a person moving closer. Instead of heading to the exit I came through, I spotted a small window near the ceiling of the hallway. It led outside at ground level. I dragged over a metal box that was sitting in the corner, climbed on it, and pushed the window frame out. It stuck for a second and my stomach dropped, and I remember thinking that if the frame didn't give, I was going to have to turn around and walk toward that staircase. I squeezed through the opening just as I heard footsteps in the hallway behind me. The distance between that sound and my body was a few meters, but it felt like if I hesitated even once, he'd be close enough to grab whatever part was still inside. Dropped onto the grass on the side of the house, ran to my van and started the engine. My legs didn't feel steady, and there was this disconnected moment where I watched my own hands shaking on the keys, like they belonged to somebody else trying to start my van. In the rearview mirror, I saw a man in a work jacket and baseball cap come out of the side entrance, but I didn't get a good look at his face. I was already pulling out of the area. He didn't run or wave or yell, just stood there looking in my direction, and for some reason that calm reaction scared me more than if he'd actually chased the van himself. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I kept checking the mirrors all the way out of that development, waiting to see headlights swing out behind me. But the road stayed empty, and it made the thing feel real. I drove straight to the company office and told my manager about the call. Turned out the service request really did come through the website, but from a temporary email address, and the listed phone number was a prepaid that was already disconnected. Seeing that ticket sitting in our system made my skin crawl, because it meant whoever set this up hadn't just randomly dialed a tech. They'd gone through the proper channels on purpose. The house I was sent to was listed as vacant. The owner had bought it as an investment and hadn't moved in yet. Police filed a report but couldn't do much more. No signs of break-in, no cameras in that area. I never figured out what exactly that person was planning. Robbery, kidnapping, or something else entirely. But since then, I never enter empty houses without verifying the address first, and I always tell dispatch where I'm headed. That minute when I heard the double voice still pops into my head sometimes. It was such a glitch in his plan, just a timing issue. But if I'd been less focused or in more of a rush, I might have ignored it. I got lucky I caught that inconsistency when I did. It happened about 18 months ago when I was renting a one-bedroom in a small apartment complex. I work from home editing articles and blog posts, so I'm usually aware of who's around, what sounds are normal in the hallway. That Saturday morning around 10, someone knocked on my door. Not the doorbell, just knuckles on the wood. I looked through the peephole and saw a woman, maybe in her 40s, in a business suit with a tablet and a big messenger bag. She looked like a courier or some kind of company rep. I wasn't expecting any deliveries, but sometimes neighbors get packages sent to the wrong door, so that was my first guess. I watched her for a few seconds before touching the lock. She wasn't shifting her weight or checking apartment numbers like a lost delivery driver. She just stood very straight, tablet against her chest, looking up at the peephole every few seconds like she knew I was there. That put me on edge. Living alone has made me careful, and my parents drilled "don't open the door to strangers" into me pretty hard. Out of habit, I crossed to the window and nudged the blinds to check the parking lot. No marked vehicles, no logos, nobody in a uniform, just the same mix of dented cars I saw every day. When I looked back through the peephole, she was already smiling at the door like we'd agreed on something. I opened the door with the chain still on, just enough to see her face. She smiled wider and said she was from the property management company, here with documents I needed to sign about utility billing adjustments. Her voice was smooth, almost rehearsed. I told her I hadn't heard anything about changes and asked what documents she meant. She glanced down at her tablet, scrolled for a second like she was checking something, then said they were recalculating water and sewage fees for the complex. She added that she needed to come inside and check the water meters in my unit. That made me stop, because our meters were all in the basement laundry room, not inside the apartments. I said that, and she kept the smile on, but it looked tighter. She said the notice about it probably got lost in the mail, and that if she couldn't verify my reading, I'd probably be overcharged. I told her I usually got emails from management, not letters, and asked to see her employee ID. For the first time, she hesitated. Then she started digging in her bag, taking a little too long, pulling out a couple of folders and a tape measure before saying she must have left it in her car. She sounded annoyed with herself and offered to go grab it while I waited with the door open. Every hair on my arms went up at that, and I told her I'd call the office to confirm first. Before she could say anything else, I shut the door, slid the deadbolt, and set the chain. My heart was pounding in that practical, adrenaline way you get when something doesn't add up. If the company was changing how they billed everyone, there would have been an email sitting in my inbox. I grabbed the little fridge magnet with the property management number on it and called. The operator picked up, and I asked if they'd sent anyone out today to check meters or get signatures. She told me no, there were no scheduled visits, no meter checks planned for the month, and they definitely hadn't sent anyone to my building. Her voice shifted from bored office tone to alert as she asked why I was asking. I said a woman claiming to be from their office had just tried to get into my apartment to check my meters. She went quiet for a second, then asked me to describe her. She said she'd logged the incident and told me to call the police if the woman came back. Then we hung up. I went straight to the peephole. Empty hallway. At the window, I scanned the lot. No company car, no suit, nothing. The woman was gone for that day. I went back to the door and checked the peephole one more time just to be sure. The hallway was still empty, same worn carpet, same closed doors. I stood there with my hand on the deadbolt, arguing with myself about whether I was overreacting. But every time I pictured her face, I kept coming back to that pause when I asked for ID. That didn't feel like some harmless misunderstanding. I grabbed my phone and called the non-emergency police line from the magnet on my fridge. I tried to sound calm while I explained what had just happened, step by step. The dispatcher listened, asked me a few questions, then transferred me to an officer. He asked my name, my apartment number, and if the woman was still outside. I told him I didn't think so, but I wasn't about to open the door to check. Then he asked if she'd tried the handle, raised her voice, or threatened me. I said no, it never got that far, but I told him her story about the meters didn't match how our building actually worked. He sighed and said they saw that kind of scam all the time. People pretend to be inspectors, utility workers, whatever they think will get someone to open up, just to see who's home alone or what's easy to grab. Sometimes, he said, they distract you at the front while another person tries a back door or window. Hearing him explain it so casually made me feel like this wasn't some weird one-off thing. He told me I'd done exactly what I should have by keeping the chain on and calling management instead of just trusting her. He said if she or anyone like her came back, I should call 911 right away. Before we hung up, he suggested I get a video doorbell or at least some kind of camera on the entrance. Treat every unannounced knock as suspicious until you know who it is. That was basically his advice. When I hung up, I went straight to my laptop and started looking up doorbell cameras. It felt a little dramatic, but it also felt better than just walking in circles around my living room worrying. I read some reviews, picked one with decent ratings that looked easy to install, and ordered it that afternoon. It showed up a few days later, and with a friend on video chat helping, I got it mounted next to my door. After that, anytime someone knocked or rang, my phone buzzed before I even stood up. Most of the time it was just packages, neighbors, or kids being loud in the hallway, but I never saw that woman on the camera again. I still think about how confident she sounded, how easily she lied about the documents and the meters like it was just another normal workday. She had the tablet, the business clothes, the messenger bag, even the little line about a notice getting lost in the mail, and none of it felt clumsy. If I'd been more tired or in a rush, I can see myself opening the door all the way and stepping aside, because that's what polite people do. Once she was inside, I doubt I would have suddenly demanded ID or told her to leave, and I keep replaying how easily that could have gone wrong. Since then, I double-check every visit, call companies to confirm, ask for ID through the closed door, and I still wonder if she tried my neighbors and whether anyone else opened their door to her. The white van without any markings passed me for the third time in 10 minutes, and that's when I knew this wasn't a coincidence. I'm 28 now, but back then I was 19 and working the late shift at my university library in Oregon. That shift ended around 11 at night, and campus felt safe enough that most of us didn't think twice about walking alone. My route from the library to Turner Hall was the same every time, 15 minutes along the central pathway. My mom had insisted I buy pepper spray before moving into the dorms, so I kept it in my jacket pocket and honestly never thought I'd ever need it. The van appeared again, this time moving slowly parallel to the sidewalk, engine barely louder than the wind, and the passenger window rolled down. A man in his 40s leaned out from the passenger seat, wearing a dark jacket with some kind of patch I couldn't read in the streetlight. "Miss Anderson?" he called, using my last name, which set off every alarm bell I had because I wasn't wearing a name tag and hadn't introduced myself. He said they were with campus security, that they'd gotten reports of a suspicious person in the area and were escorting students back to their dorms. I stopped walking for a second, trying to see his face, but he sat back in shadow like he knew exactly where the light didn't hit. His voice was too insistent, fake friendly in this rehearsed way that made me take a step back without really thinking about it. "Thanks, but I'm almost there," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady as I turned away and started walking faster, my fingers closing around the pepper spray in my pocket. Behind me, I heard him say something low to the driver, and the van began rolling forward again, creeping along the curb at my speed. When I turned off the main path toward the side entrance of my dorm, the van suddenly accelerated and swung in front of me, bumping up onto the sidewalk so it completely blocked my way. Both front doors opened at the same time. The first man stepped out from the passenger side, and a second man, younger but dressed in the same kind of dark clothing, got out from behind the wheel. The younger one shut his door and started walking around the back of the van, clearly trying to get behind me and cut off any chance I had of going back toward the main path. "Miss, you really need to come with us. This is an administration order," the older man said, and now there was nothing friendly in his voice at all. As he came closer, I finally saw their jacket patches clearly, and they looked cheap and homemade, not like anything from campus security. The van still had no logos, no markings, nothing official on it at all. I backed up, heart pounding, trying to angle myself away from both of them, but there was nowhere that didn't funnel me closer to one or the other. The older man suddenly reached out toward me, his hand going straight for my wrist. I screamed, the loudest sound I think I've ever made, and yanked my other hand out of my pocket with the pepper spray, trying to bring it up toward his face. But he was faster and slammed his other hand down on my forearm, knocking the canister out of my grip so it flew from my hand and skidded across the concrete out of reach. For a split second, everything seemed to slow down in that stupid, vivid way people always talk about after car crashes. His grip on my wrist hurt, my knees felt weak, and I could hear nothing but my own breathing and the idle rumble of the van. There was no one else on the path, no door opening, no voice yelling from a window, nothing. I remember thinking that I had done everything right, and it still didn't matter. All the warnings, all my mom's lectures, every careful choice, none of it was really enough. I thought this was it. What saved me was that the dorm's night security guard, Mr. Harris, was doing his rounds and heard my scream. He was a big guy in his 50s, ex-Marine, the kind of man everyone nodded to because he actually talked to students and remembered people. I'd seen him 100 times at the front desk, asking people how midterms were going. That night, he came around the corner of the building with his flashlight up and his radio already in his hand and yelled, "Hey! Campus security! I'm calling the police right now!" His voice was loud enough that it echoed off the brick. Both men froze. The older one swore, low. The younger one still started toward me like he could finish what they'd planned before Mr. Harris got close. Mr. Harris didn't even slow down to see which way they'd jump. He just ran straight at us and talked into his radio at the same time, saying there was an attempted abduction by Turner Hall. 2 males, dark clothing, unmarked white van. Hearing him say attempted abduction out loud did something to them. The younger guy turned and sprinted back to the van. The older one gave me this nasty look, like I'd ruined his night, then dropped my wrist so fast my hand tingled and ran after him. Both front doors slammed, the van jerked off the sidewalk, and they took the corner so hard I thought they were going to flip it. Then they were gone. Mr. Harris chased them for a few steps, like he was ready to grab the door if he could reach it, then stopped and came back to me. I was still standing there with my arm half up and nothing in my hand. "You okay? Are you hurt?" he asked. I tried to say something useful, but all that came out was, "They knew my name," over and over. He kept a little distance, just held his hand out like a barrier and said, "All right, we're going inside. Lobby. Cameras. People." I just did what he said. Inside, with the bright lobby lights and the girl at the front desk staring at me like she was seeing a crime scene, it hit me. My legs went out, and I sat down hard on one of the ugly lobby chairs and started crying in that messy, hiccuping way where you can't stop. Mr. Harris told the desk worker to grab tissues and some water, then kept talking into his radio, repeating that the suspects had fled in a white van and giving their direction again and again. The police showed up fast. 2 officers talked to me while another walked the path outside with Mr. Harris. They asked what had happened, what they were wearing, how old they looked, anything I remembered. I kept getting stuck on the same parts: the van, the man's hand on my wrist, the fact that he said my last name like he knew me. I apologized at least 3 times for not remembering the license plate, and one of the officers told me to stop saying sorry, that most people didn't remember plates even on a normal day. Another officer came back in with my pepper spray in an evidence bag and said they'd found it up by the curb. They had me write a statement and then go through it out loud so they could ask questions. They wrote down my class schedule, my room number, my parents' info. They said there would be extra patrols around Turner Hall and the library for a while, and told me to call 911 immediately if I ever saw that van again. They never called me back with an update. As far as I know, no one ever found that exact van or those two men while I was still at that university. After that night, I completely changed how I moved around campus. I didn't walk anywhere alone after dark, even if it was just from the library to my dorm. If I had a late shift, I left with another student or called campus security for an escort. I didn't care if anyone thought it was overkill. My roommates knew to text me if they went out and weren't back by a certain time, and I did the same for them. For a long time, I slept with my desk lamp on and my phone right next to my face. Every car that idled outside the dorm made me sit up and listen until it drove away. People joked about the van story, but nobody laughed when they were walking home alone. It's been 9 years now. I live in a different state, different job, different everything, but that night is still sitting there in my head. If a white van slows down anywhere near me, even if it has a company logo on the side, my stomach drops before I can remind myself it's probably just a delivery. I don't get into cars with people I barely know, period. With ride shares, I double-check the plate, the driver's name, and send a screenshot to a friend without even thinking about it. Some people roll their eyes and say I'm paranoid, but they weren't there when those guys pulled up next to a 19-year-old girl who just wanted to walk home. Mr. Harris became kind of a quiet hero on campus after that. Everyone heard that he'd scared off 2 men who tried to grab a student, and he just kept saying he was only doing his job. I still think about him a lot. I'm sure of one thing. If he hadn't been right there doing his rounds, if he'd taken a break or walked a different side of the building, they would have gotten me into that van, and I honestly don't know how my story would have ended. After my divorce, I moved to this small town upstate looking for a quieter life away from the city. I was 25, no kids, no real ties, just a car full of boxes and a lease on a tiny upstairs apartment over a laundromat. The plan was simple in my head. Work, save some money, hike on weekends, figure out who I was without my ex attached to everything. It sounded healthy enough, but the reality was a lot of evenings eating frozen dinners alone and scrolling my phone so I didn't have to think too hard. The town itself was fine, kind of the standard upstate New York place where everyone already seems to know each other from kindergarten. I'd always loved hiking, and back in the city, my ex and I would drive out every weekend to hit different trails. Here I didn't know anyone yet, and I'm not the type to walk into a bar and ask strangers if they like sleeping in tents. One afternoon, I cut behind a row of houses and noticed the power lines running through a strip of woods. The corridor under them cleared into a rough path. In the US, they keep those areas trimmed for maintenance, so it basically looked like a trail someone had forgotten to label. The access started next to a private driveway by a small ranch house, but the path veered right pretty fast, far enough that I figured I wouldn't be bothering anybody. I followed it in my sneakers that first day, no pack, just curiosity, and turned around once the town noise faded, but the rooftops were still in sight. On the way back, I got this idea to do a solo overnight up there, close enough to cell service to feel safe, but far enough to pretend it was real wilderness. I'd never camped alone before. It had always been me and my ex, his gear, his plan, his car, and I wanted to prove to myself I wasn't helpless without him. That week, I checked the forecast, made a little list, bought fuel for my camp stove, and texted my sister my plan with a dropped pin at the trailhead. I told her, half joking, that if I didn't text by Sunday night, she needed to blow up my phone. Saturday morning, I parked on the street near that house, did an awkward little wave toward the closed curtains in case anyone was watching, and headed up under the humming lines with my pack. The tent was strapped to the bottom, food and stove inside, and I remember feeling weirdly proud and nervous at the exact same time. I followed the power lines uphill until a narrow path branched left, one of those faint deer trails you see everywhere out here, and took it just to see where it went. After maybe 15 minutes, it opened into a flat, grassy clearing tucked between trees. No fire ring, no trash, just a clean patch of ground that felt like it had been waiting for a tent. I dropped my pack, checked for dead branches overhead and any obvious holes, then set up camp, stove off to the side, food sealed, small fire built on bare dirt. That night, I mostly just sat there listening, jumping at every twig snap and rustle, reminding myself that this was exactly why I'd come out here alone. I slept in short chunks, waking up to check my phone and the time, but nothing came crashing through the trees, and by sunrise I felt wrung out and oddly calmer. I made instant coffee, ate a granola bar, looked at the quiet little clearing, and decided I'd go see where that path ended before packing up. I grabbed water and my phone, followed the trail for about an hour, past some fenced farm fields off to the right, then came to a fork and took the more worn right side just to see what was there. The trail curved past an old van streaked with rust and clothes inside, and farther on, I saw a doll hanging from a branch by a rope like a noose. My heart jumped, but what I saw next was worse. To the right of the tree with the doll was this huge metal cage structure, maybe 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, welded together from pipes and rebar. At first, I thought it was some kind of weird hunting blind or maybe scrap someone stacked there, but as I got closer, I saw it was an actual cage. It had 4 walls and a ceiling, and the bars were spaced so close I could barely get 2 fingers between them. There was no way a person could squeeze through, not even a kid. The door was made from the same stuff, held shut with a thick chain looped around twice, and an old padlock that was so rusted I couldn't tell if it still worked. Several more dolls were hanging off the cage, tied to the bars by their arms and necks. Some were missing eyes or limbs, their plastic faces gray and cracked, clothes stiff with dirt. Those same dark brownish streaks I'd seen on the van ran down the sides of the metal, darker in some spots, like something had been poured or splashed over and over in the same places. I told myself it was paint or oil, anything but what it actually looked like, because the second I said that word in my head, it was going to be real in a way I didn't want to deal with alone in the woods. Behind the cage, maybe 50 yards past it, I could see this run-down house partly hidden by trees. The windows I could see were broken or boarded, the roof sagging on one side. There were no cars, no sounds, nothing that made it look lived in, but there was also no graffiti or trash like you usually see around abandoned places. It looked like somebody still cared enough to keep people away from it, and that bothered me more than if it had just been wrecked. I stood there way too long, trying to make it fit into something normal. Like maybe some edgy artist had built an installation out here, or some hunter made a trap for animals, even though the cage was obviously sized for a person, and there was nothing inside it except dirt and some old leaves blown in through the gaps. I remember realizing there were no beer cans, no fire pits, none of the usual signs that bored teenagers had been there. It was just the cage, the dolls, those stains, and that house behind it. That's when my brain finally kicked in and just screamed, "Get out." There wasn't one big moment. It was more like my body decided before my thoughts caught up. My hands started shaking so hard my phone almost slipped, and I suddenly felt very exposed on that trail with open ground on every side. If someone was in that house, or in the trees, they had a perfect view of me. I turned around and ran. I'm not a runner. I'm heavy and I'd been smoking for 10 years, but I ran that day faster than I ever had. Branches hit my arms, my boots slid on loose dirt, and I kept expecting to hear someone behind me, metal clanking, a shout, anything. I don't remember most of the run back, just quick flashes. The hanging doll swinging in my peripheral vision as I sprinted past. The van flashing by, that broken windshield catching the sun. My chest burning and my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might just quit on me. Somehow I reached my campsite, barely slowed down, and grabbed my tent in one motion, ripping it out of the ground stakes and all, the poles bending as I yanked. I threw the whole mess over my shoulder and just kept running downhill. I left my cooler, my food, my sleeping bag, everything except the tent I was carrying. My little camping chair, my mug, the brand new fuel canister I'd bought that week, all of it stayed right there. The tent stakes ripped free along the way and the fabric tore on branches, but I didn't stop once to fix it. Going down that hill, I half slid, half fell, grabbing trees to keep from rolling, but somehow I didn't break my neck. When I finally saw the power line corridor open up ahead of me, I almost started crying from relief. I hit the street, spotted my car, and practically dove inside. I threw the tent in the trunk without folding it, slammed every door, and locked it over and over like that somehow made it safer. My hands were shaking so badly I fumbled the keys before I got the engine started. I remember checking the rearview mirror again and again as I drove home, sure I was going to see that van or another car pull out and follow me, even though no one had chased me, no one had called out. Back at my apartment, I parked crooked, ran up the stairs, and locked every door and window I had. I pulled the curtains shut and walked from room to room, checking closets and under the bed, even though I knew nobody could have gotten there before me. I couldn't stop pacing. Every time a car went by or someone shut a door in the hallway, I jumped. I kept scrolling my phone, hovering over the keypad like I was going to call the police, then putting it down again. I told myself I'd sound crazy. I told myself I didn't even know how to explain where it was without going back out there with them. That was 8 years ago. I live almost 1,400 miles away now in a completely different climate, different job, different life. But typing this out, my hands are still shaking. I never went hiking alone again after that. Honestly, I barely go into the woods at all anymore, even with other people. The crazy thing is, I wasn't even deep in the woods, just maybe a mile from houses, close enough that you could probably hear a dog barking if the wind was right. People lived within a short walk of that place, kids rode their bikes on those streets, and I never called the cops. I still don't have a good reason why, except that I was terrified whoever made that cage would somehow find out I reported it and track me down, that my name would end up in some report, or they'd ask me to show them the exact spot, and whoever owned that house would see me standing there with police. I know I should have called, and I still feel guilty about it. I hope it was just some old crime scene from decades ago, long cleared and forgotten, and not something that was still being used when I stumbled across it. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that cage, those dolls, those stains, and I wonder if I was the only person who ever found it, or if there were others before me.